shop on 49667.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
Pastor Mai, good afternoon. It's 6 minutes after 12 midday. Mannin Line's on till 1. Today, we're talking about the weather, talking about the climate, how you feel about it, how's it measured, how long has it been measured for, and exactly why are we so fascinated with the weather. So, on the text, 166 177, email studio@magsradio.com, call 66 13 68, or you can WhatsApp on 07624 166 177. Today, it's all about the weather. So then there's only one person to talk to. Adrian Cowin is here from the Met Office at Ronaldsway. Did you say 39 years?
Exactly, Andy. It's quite shocking, really.
39 years.
Absolutely.
And why did you choose weather?
I was interested in science in general, physics in particular, applied physics, and the atmosphere and weather, all right time, right place to get a job, and here I am 39 years later.
Which school did you go to, Adi?
Castle Rushen High School.
Okay. Any weather taught at the school then, was there?
Only in the context of geography lessons, and of course in the science lessons, in the physics lessons, you got to understand about fluid dynamics and gas pressures and such like. So sets the foundations for understanding how the atmosphere behaves.
Okay, obviously it has to follow the laws of physics. Consequently, weather is logical. Is that right? Is weather logical?
Most of the times,
you can't change the laws of physics.
No, you can't. But understanding how the atmosphere can sometimes go off piste a little bit, shall we say. There's still some unknowns about the details of atmospheric physics and how the atmosphere behaves, interacts with the oceans, and when it's crossing large land masses. It's greatly come on in many, many years that I've been working. The computing power, the monitoring power, the analysis power, much, much better to understand how the atmosphere and all the models that the weather models and the climate models to this very date are still being tweaked and improved to make them better and better.
Is it all about computers nowadays?
The detail, the level of detail that we now get, it is all about the computing power linked to the monitoring power that is the wonders of satellite imagery, satellite sensors. Feed all that data into the supercomputers and these developing models, and the output you then get is very high quality, although you still need a person to interpret the output, the data.
When you started back in, was it 1983?
Yes, indeed.
1983 you started. What was the level of technology at the airport at Ronaldsway, at the Met Office?
Well, besides thermometers for temperature and anemometers for wind speed and direction and rain gauges, the on-the-desk technology was a telephone, a fax machine, pencil, paper and a couple of pens. And you would plot a chart. You would manually plot a chart of the readings from the Isle of Man and beyond, and then you would analyse the chart and start trying to figure out what's going on.
You'd physically draw it?
Absolutely, yes.
And did you, in those days, did you think, was the technology moving along then? Were computers coming in?
It was knocking on the door, and within a few years we were lucky enough to get one of the first IBM PCs at the airport and possibly within Isle of Man government. I think there was only one or two knocking around in Douglas, but the Met Office at the airport got one of these wonderful fangled IBM PCs.
So you've spanned both eras then. You've seen the analogue, you're very firmly into the digital now.
Yes.
So the big question is it better than it was then?
Oh, so much better, because in those days, because it was analogue and manual, you would need 4 people in the office to stay on top of it and feed that information, plot that information, update it. Now it can be a one-man show, and often is down at the airport. At any one time, there's just one forecaster on duty, day or night. And so that technology has allowed us to do that. All the information is readily available. It's automatically plotted. It's more up to date. The computer models are better. It's a one-man show.
Interestingly, that technology has come this far, but people are still fascinated by the weather. I mean, literally fascinated by the weather, fixated on it sometimes, Adi.
Oh, absolutely they are, yeah. I mean, it's still one of the things that people most talk about, as we know. And as well as that, it's the one thing that people are always checking. In the old days, when I was first in the office, the first decade or so, phone calls, loads and loads of them, all the time, day and night. But then you move on to other technologies, and now everybody checks on their phone. They look up the latest on their app, or they go to gov.im, or they go to manxradio.com, and there it is, the latest forecast. It's there for you all the time.
So what did people used to call up and ask? Is it going to rain?
Oh, all the usual. Is it going to rain? What's it going to be like for playing golf tomorrow? What's it like for hanging the washing out? What's it going to be like for the boat in the morning? Yes, sir. And we still get those. And our farming friends still ring up for personalised forecast, personal advice.
And I'm going to come to that as well, because you do provide weather forecasts for commercial clients to see what's going to happen in the future. Without naming names, what sort of stuff does the Met Office supply?
Well, yes, so the people are planning, and it's resource planning, I suppose you'd call it, and logistics, and weather can have an impact on that, on your supply chain. Or your travel arrangements if you're a business anyway, but also you're stocking what you might need for the weekend ahead. So if the forecast is for some warm sunshine, as it is for this coming weekend, you can bet your bottom dollar that the big retailers and the small retailers get their order in now to sort of stocked up for the sort of things that people will need or want to have for a warm weekend for sunshine.
Okay. Do you have a notion, do you have a gut feeling about what the weather's going to be like? Because, I mean, how accurately, how far ahead can you predict?
Well, that's changed over the decades as well. When I started, you were lucky to get the next 2 or 3 days right, but that soon became 5 days, and now it's reliable out to 7 days. But in fact, behind the scenes, we have access to models that are actually good to go for 10 days ahead. After that, the storyline will start to diverge. Small errors at the beginning of the model sequence separate out and amplify and grow by day 10. So you could be out by 12 hours in timing, or you could be out by a few hundred miles in position of a weather front. But we're good to go for 7 days on a regular basis for something useful and accurate.
Okay, I've got a message in from Max just to say, how does that Saharan sand arrive on the Isle of Man?
Well, yes, that's a regular feature, really. It happens more often than people sometimes realise. So you get the pressure setups so that high pressure might exist for a while over northern Europe, including the British Isles. Meanwhile, further south, you get areas of low pressure diverted over towards Africa. So you get strong winds over the deserts. Now, sometimes those strong winds were so strong and warm air that will be lifted high into the atmosphere. Then you just need the jet stream to engage with that atmospheric sand, the atmospheric dust high up, and that jet stream steers it usually northwards or northeastwards into Europe. Sometimes it will go just over continental Europe, but there's other times it will engage all the way as far across to the British Isles. And then the final ingredients that you need some rain clouds. So the rain clouds have to engage with the dust cloud, and Bob's your uncle, you get rain that leaves a deposit of dust or Saharan dust on the ground on parked vehicles.
Thousands of tons.
Thousands of tons lifted into the atmosphere. Absolutely, it's incredible, the energy that the atmosphere has got to lift that much sand particles, large areas of sand, high into the atmosphere.
Does the jet stream, does it go west to east?
Generally speaking, in the northern hemisphere, it is west to east, but that often has a perturbation where it will go sometimes southeast, east or northeast as it comes towards the British Isles, and hence the variation in the weather pressure systems that you get, whether you get a deepening low or a building area of high pressure. Okay,
and does the jet stream, because we hear lots of talk about the jet stream actually moving, its trajectory has changed over time, is that true?
It does change all the time, to be fair, but its long-term average position does seem to migrate a little bit sooner in the year northwards. But the other thing that seems to be increasing is what we call meandering. So instead of that normal flow from west to east, it now buckles, and you end up something more north to south. And that becomes the mechanism that causes blocking highs. So you get an area of high pressure that becomes established and gets stuck in one location, sometimes for a few weeks.
In terms of and this is Susie who just emailed in about the Irish Sea. She said, my father was in the Navy and he said the Irish Sea has its own microclimate. Is that true?
Well, indeed, not only the Irish Sea, but the Isle of Man as well. At the end of the day, a little lump of rock, beautiful piece of rock in the middle of the Irish Sea. You see such variation from north, south, west and east. But also the Irish Sea itself is partially, I suppose, enclosed by the larger land masses of Britain and Ireland.
So obviously, the Irish Sea is, in effect, there's obviously an inlet at the top by Scotland and an inlet at the bottom by Wales and Ireland. So Susie was just saying the wave dynamics, the way that it is, the tides and what have you, in that the Irish Sea. So just say, what does the Irish Sea, what sort of influence does that have on our weather, let's say?
Well, first of all, the Irish sea temperature is a big player in the game. It moderates the air mass that's coming towards you. And by the air mass, that's the lump of air that's in the atmosphere that's heading towards the British Isles and then into the Irish Sea somehow. So, for instance, air that comes from the south or southwest will be a warm air mass that usually carries some moisture. And especially at this time of year, that moisture gets cooled off by the cool, pretty waters of the Irish Sea, and you get some condensation, which manifests itself as low cloud, mist, Mannin's cloak, etc. But in this winter time, the Irish Sea's had a chance to warm up by a few degrees. So I'm told, although I never dip my foot into the Irish Sea very often.
You're not a sea swimmer.
No, not at all. But in the winter, it is our friend because it has warmed up by those few degrees, and it will save us from the impact of those colder air masses that we get in the winter from the east or the northeast or the north. It modifies that air by a few degrees, so the Isle of Man doesn't suffer unusually cold temperatures.
It's like an air conditioner.
It is, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it saves us so many times, both winter and summer. It's basically mostly our friend, the Irish Sea.
We're with Adrian Cowin, Senior Met Officer from Ronaldsway. If you want to get in touch, text 166. Got lots of text to get through. If you want to call 66 13 68, or you can WhatsApp as well.
We all have a Ginger Hall memory. Whether it's watching the TT on Dad's knee, or singing Happy Birthday in the garden, or watching Grandad do the robot at your cousin's wedding. Have your event at the Ginge. We're an approved partner of Conister Bank, and finance options are available, including a 3-month payment holiday up front. With great food and drink in a spectacular setting, you won't be disappointed. Make a Ginger Hall memory. Visit the Ginger Hall events on Facebook. Rates and repayment terms subject to terms and conditions.
Now is definitely the season to visit Ramsey Garden Centre, where there's something new and unique arriving in store every week. Right now, find a huge array of colourful summer bedding and basket plants, plus pots and ceramics for indoor and outdoor plants, lovely gift ideas, solar lights and fabulous garden decor. Visit us on Facebook to see what's new at Ramsey Garden Centre. For expert information, call 816 506 or take a trip to Ramsey Garden Centre, open 7 days a week on Albert Road.
You want how much? 1% commission? That's £2,000 to sell my house. That's it. I'm seeing red.
Sick of huge commission fees? Don't get mad. See red. With CG Red, the new service from Cowley Groves, you can sell any house up to £350,000 for a fixed £750 fee. That's a saving of up to £2,750 on what you'd pay with a traditional estate agent.
So go on, see red. Visit cgred.im. They're giving other estate agents a darn good thrashing.
So, Dick Barton, now I have you in my grasp. You see this mechanism? I will lower you into it inch by inch to create a Dick roll. Over there is a goldfish. It is swimming at precisely...
Come on, Scarheart. We've only got 30 seconds. Don't you know how radio works? Let me explain it to you, old chap.
Will Barton thwart Scareheart's evil plan? Find out at the Gaiety Theatre from the 23rd to the 25th of June for the next instalment of Dick Barton, Special Agent, supported by the nation station, Manx Radio.
Ardent followers of Manx politics will undoubtedly have been both fascinated and enthralled by last week's momentous political event. While the departure of now former Treasury Minister David Ashford seemed inevitable, the Chief Minister's Tynwald statement was extensive in policy announcements, but rather light in terms of directly addressing the findings of the Industrial Tribunal. After taking some time to recover from last week's excitement, Alistair Ramsey tries to make sense of these dramatic events with me, Phil Gorn. That's all on Agenda at 6 p.m. this evening on Manx Radio. The programme also available as a podcast, cutting through the rhetoric and pondering the future.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
21 minutes after 12 with Adrian Cowin from the Met Office. Howard, you're live with Adrian.
Hello, Andy. Morning, Adrian. Just something that was always said to me when the Met Office, as we knew it, not the one at Ronaldsway, the BBC, etc., they used blocks of weather somewhere around about 70 square miles, which they would interpret onto a map. But my uncle, he sailed deep sea all of his life, and he said the Irish Sea was unpredictable. Would that be one of the possible causes of weather coming down either from the north or the south and being funneled through the Irish Sea by the Mourne Mountains and the Cumbria Hills? Because I've always found that the Ronaldsway Met Office seemed to deal with a much more finite area as opposed to being a large area on a map.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, interesting thoughts on that, and the size of the blocks, as you call them, were originally large, as you say, but with the development of more monitoring and computer modelling and computing power, those block sizes have come all the way down in size now. And one of the operational ones that we use quite often is in a 10-kilometre block. And it's also stacked vertically into about at least 40 levels. I think it might be more levels than that vertically. We also have models available to us that are as small as 4 kilometres, and there's a short-term model that gives detail in 2-kilometre blocks, so that you've gone from, I suppose, low resolution to high resolution now. HD models that give us very good guidance. But as you say, local effects in the Irish Sea come into play anyway, and you build up a working knowledge by experience of those, especially as we interact with our friends who are master mariners and such likes. The local effects of the funnelling, as you say, from the North Channel to the Isle of Man. At a local level, the funnelling you can get, for instance, from Fleshick Gap down into Port St Mary and Carrick Bay. There are effects from the mountains of Mourne. There are also lee effects from the high ground of the Lake District and also from Snowdonia. So all those different directions do have an effect on the climate, weather, or the impacts on a daily scenario for the Isle of Man. But the best part is that improved resolution in the computer models really help us to hone in on the details.
So I've always found that the forecasts, say from Ronaldsway, because I can remember the boys upstairs in their room, as Adrian said, drawing their plans on paper, because your office was right above our office when I worked there. But the plans themselves now, as you say, are more finite, but I've always relied and found a big difference at one time between the general forecast and the local ones, and the local ones were more believable at the time.
Well, thank you, and I hope they still are. We do try to add what we call value added or quality, because strangely enough, the broad brush, the general forecast is easy to do. As you'll see on the television presenters, they talk about some rain in the north and west. Well, let's have some local detail, and that's what you get with the Ronaldsway Met Office. You get the local detail for the Isle of Man and the Irish Sea, for the range of customers that we have, but also the general public, the working public on the island, and the travelling public who are concerned about their flights, their boat crossings, and your farmers who are trying to plan the best use of the resource according to the weather conditions. You have to zoom in to that local level of detail from the models, plus the valuable experience that we build up as forecasters on the Isle of Man.
Yes, you're saying about all the various equipment you had many years ago. I can remember your rain gauge out on the edge of the
yes,
what do you call it?
Out on the apron.
Apron, that's the
yes,
word.
Down at the Met
the boy used
enclosure.
to walk out 2 or 3 times a day to read the rain gauge.
That's right, and all those things have to be done at a certain time of day, and not only nationally but internationally. It's agreed that you have to empty that rain gauge officially and take that measurement at least once every 24 hours, and we all do that at 0900 GMT.
Okay, Okay, well, thank you, Adrian, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
And let's hope we get forecast good weather for the next couple of weeks.
We'll do our best.
All right, thanks, Howard. Well, that's interesting because you often are tasked with moving mist off the mountain. How many times have we heard it? Everything's fine at Glencrutchery Road, then in comes mist on the mountain. Why does that happen?
Well, yes, it's one of those things that come to challenge us, especially during the TT period. So at this time of year, especially when we've got these often moist south to southwesterlies that are chilling off over the Irish Sea, if that wasn't enough, as the air rises because of its passage over the land, it's rising up against our hills, it cools. It cools a slightly more, but usually by at least a couple of degrees. And that couple of degrees of cooling, yet again, means that moisture carried in the air can condense into the mist and the low cloud that comes to plague the mountain road.
Here's a note in from G, who just said, this is a nice specific one, Adrian. What effect did the Fiji volcano eruption have on the world climate, specifically the UK climate? Well, you can generalise that one if you want.
I'd prefer to generalise that because the volcanic eruptions generally do have an input into the climate of the hemispheres of the planet. Northern hemisphere especially can be affected. But they'd have an impact that they will stay high in the atmosphere. The dust particles from volcanoes will be transported globally, and they will create usually a slight degree of cooling in many parts of the planet. And the best example I've got for that is the 2010 Icelandic eruption, and that did cause some cooling for the rest of the year in the northern hemisphere.
And that was, how long did that was it kept on erupting for ages, didn't it, that thing? It had about, and it travelled, the trajectory was south, didn't it? The lava went up into the atmosphere and came south. So there are a couple of dozen, maybe 3 dozen active volcanoes at any one time, I think, around the world. So, volcanoes are a big thing. I'm trying to remember there was a particular runway, there's a particular airport that's near a volcano and they couldn't land for months and months and months. Luckily, no volcanoes around the Irish Sea. Here's an interesting one that also said, is it true that they can control the weather? This stuff about seeding clouds, how does that happen?
Well, it is on a micro scale. It is possible to seed clouds with particles, crystals that will encourage raindrops to grow within the cloud structure. So cloud seeding can happen, but it's a tricky operation. It's a very micro scale operation in terms of success rate in a small area. But sometimes desperate measures, it has been attempted in various parts of the world who are suffering long-term droughts, and they go to do some cloud seeding.
And can you do it the other way round? Can you get rid of rain clouds? Because we hear all sorts of apocryphal tales about this.
No. Cloud dispersal, that would be a big ask. As a physicist, I'd say I can't imagine the amount of energy you'd have to involve to be able to do something like that. Okay,
another one that we can nail then here, chemtrails. Are chemtrails a possibility? Could they work? Do they work? Are they a real thing?
They're not a real thing, but we essentially do get calls and emails about chemtrails, and it's something that I don't think there's enough evidence about at all. I've never seen anything that convinces me that the chemtrails are a real thing. Of course, we do see lots of contrails in the sky, which is a different thing altogether.
Contrails is?
The contrails is the ice crystals forming by the remaining moisture of unburnt jet fuel, sometimes in the high atmosphere. You'll see those under certain conditions. So those are the contrails behind the transatlantic jets that we sometimes see, even over the Isle of Man.
And sometimes we get an awful lot of those. What height? They're 30,000 feet, are they?
Yes, depending on the nature of the atmosphere on any particular day, they can be anything between 25,000 all the way up to 40,000 feet.
Okay, more messages in. Adrian, I suffer from seasonal affective disorder, SAD, and I struggle with the weather living here, particularly January and February. I can cope with cold, sunny. You didn't know you were going to be doing therapy here, did you? I can cope with cold, sunny days, but grey, rainy days are difficult. We always try to go abroad in the autumn and the winter. Climate's my number one priority when arranging travel. So at the moment, the Isle of Man wouldn't be my first choice as a tourist if weather was an issue. I just live here. That's seasonal affective disorder. Do people get depressed by the weather, Adi?
I think they do. I mean, that's well researched by medical colleagues, and various aspects of the weather can put people down physically or mentally. One of the things, obviously, is a lack of sunshine during the winter months, and this happens in Northern Europe as well as around the British Isles. People who are not getting enough daylight doesn't really put their chemicals in motion in their brain, in their body, to activate them. And, you know, a lot of Northern Europeans head south for some part of the winter to start to feel better again, really.
OK, Kirsty, a note in for Adi. Look, there's an undoubted climate change in the world, says Kirsty. Has there been a difference on the Isle of Man yet from this? Is there a change in the climate here?
Yes, there is. This is the one thing I go out and talk about over recent years. It's a measurable change, even on the Isle of Man, and in particular the temperature records from Ronaldsway and Douglas, which go back even further than the Ronaldsway records, are showing a confirmation that's consistent with climate change measurements around the planet. And by that, I mean our nighttime temperatures in the last few decades are now up to 1.2 Celsius warmer than what they were previously when the airport started taking measurements in 1947. And even our daytime temperatures on average are now 0.8 Celsius warmer than they used to be.
So the island's warmer in the past 70, 80 years?
Yes, most of the change has actually been measured to have happened in the last 30 years. And in fact, I was looking up before coming here just to confirm my facts that 14 of our warmest years have been in the last 20 years, and 7 of those themselves have been in the last decade.
Are we wetter than we used to be, Abe?
We are slightly, but only at certain times of the year. And again, I'm glad I pre-prepared for that one. We looked at our statistics for the last 30 years in comparison to the 45 years before that on the Isle of Man. And we've discovered that there's a slight increase in rainfall May, July and August, but the biggest one is the change in rainfall in October and November. We're up by an extra couple of days on average. And how does that look in terms of amount of rainfall? It doesn't sound a lot, but it's consistent that our autumn months there, October, November, we're up by between 10 and 15 millimetres of rainfall in comparison to previous decades.
How do you stand on climate change, AD? I mean, you're obviously a trained scientist. You've been a Met man for, I won't keep on saying how many years. So I just wonder do you have a firm opinion on it?
Yes, that climate change is real. It is happening, and I also accept that it always has, but it's always happened under natural processes over a long cycle, and a slow cycle at that. The man-made climate change that we're experiencing in the last 20 to 30 years in particular is more significant in that it can be measured globally, and it's the rate of climate change which is the alarming figure to me as a scientist. The rate of change, atmospheric warming, global sea level rise caused by the warming. The oceans themselves have increased their ocean heat content, and a warmer ocean expands. And of course, we have the other aspects of it. We're concerned about greenhouse gases, accelerating that process, and we're also concerned about the loss of ice, sea ice, and of course, a glacier melt.
Obviously, I mean, you don't strike me as a hothead. You're very circumspect in approaching this. So, as a scientist, as a Met man, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I'm still optimistic because I'm a great believer in science and technology and engineering. I think we can overcome most of these aspects if we're given enough time, and that's the key thing. To give us enough time, perhaps we need to take some mitigations in the short term to reduce the impact of man on climate change, because I think man-made structures and such likes can be built bigger and stronger. It takes time, it takes money. Yes, you decide if you want to do that. but also I think it's important for the natural world, because not only does mankind have to have time to adapt, the natural world needs time to adapt. So if you can just stretch out the time scale, there's a chance we'll be okay.
Okay, and where do you see the future lying? How can this be mitigated? How can it be possibly reversed?
I don't see how we can get to the reversal stage. We're just so much dependent upon all the things that we expect to be able to do and do it today or this year. What I'd expect to see perhaps is less reliance on fossil fuels as soon as possible, and we know all about that. Looking for renewable energy schemes is definitely one way forward, and that technology and engineering's come along in the terms of wind power, wind farms, wind turbines, solar power, coastal tidal power, wave power. All those technologies just need a little bit more time to roll out, and I think that'll make a big difference to the carbon footprint of the planet.
Okay, as a man then, where do you think the Isle of Man has got the best resources for natural energy? Is it wind power? Is it solar? Is it wave, tidal?
I think on the scheme of things for the Isle of Man, tidal and wave power may be too large a task to take on board. I think the simple one, that where the technology already exists and it's very efficient and reliable technology, is wind power.
Okay, of course there isn't. There's nothing. It's the old NIMBY, it's the old planning and what have you. Do you think it should be onshore or offshore wind power for the island?
Well, the most reliable area for wind power, reliable speed, consistent speed is coastal, preferably offshore by a few miles, where you get a consistent wind speed, and it's ideal in the Irish Sea to most of the time have the speeds that would generate useful power just about every day, every night.
And where would be the most reliable place? North, south, east, west?
I think they're all essentially reliable. I would suspect the most steady wind flow could actually be to the on the west and south side of the Isle of Man.
Adrian Cowin is with us today on Mannin Line, and lots of love actually for Kirsty Pendlebury. Please express my thanks to Kirsty Pendlebury. Her forecasts and explanations are very good. Of course, you get it all live on the breakfast show as well. Despite all the research that scientists have, this is Phil who just said, despite all the research scientists have done regarding climate change, there are still so many people who argue about this and whether or not it's true. We even have some politicians and what have you who say there's not enough research to prove. If you wouldn't mind commenting, says Phil, is it your opinion that it is indisputable that human-influenced climate change is happening, Adi?
I believe it is solidly. Myself and my colleagues do as well, if I may speak for them. But more importantly, the United Nations do themselves, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the international body of decision makers, politicians, scientists, massive organisation now, and they're all in agreement about this. And hence we have the Conference of Parties, the COP meetings, that they gather on off the back of this to consider these reports, look at monitoring, they look at mitigations and planning and agreements and strategies. So I think internationally it is now just so widely accepted by so many people, it is real.
Okay, Colin just dropped a note in. Did you say the south and the west of the Isle of Man for wind power?
Just that I think the wind flow there would be more consistent, more steady.
And that's it, because Colin's just saying, is it true you can? Yeah, the southwest wind is the best for the Isle of Man.
In that, for the British Isles, the prevailing wind is a southwesterly. So
okay.
Yes.
Des said, is it true you can draw a line from Douglas Bay to Antarctica without hitting land?
Yes. Correct.
Yes. I'm glad you know.
Yes.
I've always found Adrian's calm and knowledgeable presentation of the weather forecast very reassuring. And says Roger, who dropped this note in as well. So your nice calming voice can tell us all the bad news about climate change, Adrian. Interestingly now, because in effect, the weather's become political. I mean, politics has got involved with climate and climate change. You don't consider yourself political, do you?
No, I don't at all, although I did a lengthy period as an Arbury Parish Commissioner, but that's at local level and local issues in general, and those days have gone now. But I understand that scientists in particular, with regards to climate change, need to interact very more closely with politicians, with decision makers, to help inform them, answer their questions. So in that respect, we do have that political interface. But we give the evidence and perhaps sometimes give some thoughts and maybe options to be considered, but decision makers then have to go away and consider their priorities and their resources and what's going to be done next.
Okay, Tommy. Hi, Tommy. You're live with Adrian Cowin.
Oh, hi, Andy. Hi, Adrian.
Hello there.
I've been listening to you since 1869, I think, Adrian.
Feels like that. I've been around a long time. No. Yes, yeah.
No, you're doing a good job, mate. I was thinking about Indian summers. But you know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Well, yes. Carry on.
You know when you get to the autumn,
yes, absolutely,
and you get a nice period through, almost through into October, of nice calm weather.
Yes.
How does that happen, Adi?
So sometimes we do get lucky enough that the Atlantic weather systems get blocked for a while. As I was saying at the beginning of the show, sometimes the jet streams become meridional. In other words, they become north-south, and you get a high-pressure block. And if you get that high-pressure block in the right place at the right time, the air feeding into the British Isles for a period of a week or two, if you're lucky, will be drier and warmer for a while. It'll feed in something from the south, or the southeast, as we benefit from the last warmth from the year before we go into the autumn proper, and you can end up with those quieter conditions thanks to the high pressure, but also the dry warm air gives you some late sunshine, and you just think, oh, this is effectively what you could call an Indian summer.
Okay, Tommy.
Oh, thanks, Andy. I can tell all my pals now and pretend it's me that knows everything.
All right, thanks for calling today. Here's another message in for Adrian Cowin. Alan, who just said, is the weather always better in the north of the Isle of Man than the south?
It's surprising how many times it is better in the north. It's all down to that prevailing wind direction again that we've mentioned, the southwesterly. So if that southwesterly is prevailing, as it often is, bringing the low cloud and mist and drizzly stuff to the south of the Isle of Man and up onto the mountain road, the atmospheric conditions are such that it starts drying out that low-level air, and sometimes that misty, murky, moist air just cannot get past our hills in the middle of the island. So as the air then descends from the hills to the northern plain, the clouds disperse and disappear, the air becomes warmer, so you end up with a sunny slot in the north of the island that's not only drier but brighter. And that is measured. We have measured it over the years. The statistics from the Point of Ayre Lighthouse prove that it's drier, it's warmer, and it's sunnier.
Okay, so if you're having solar panels, the north is the place to be.
Indeed.
It's 16 minutes before 1, live with Adrian Cowin, Senior Met Man from Ronaldsway on Mannin Line.
In our quest to remove all single-use plastic from our milk packaging, Isle of Man Creamery cartons, including the new 1.75 litre carton, are now 100% recyclable, made from sustainable and renewable sources. We're the first in the British Isles to offer these new large cartons, and you can pick them up now in local retailers or add them to your Isle of Man Creamery doorstep delivery. Plant-based cartons from Isle of Man Creamery. Better for the environment, better for you.
Every drop is precious. Water. So easy to take it for granted, isn't it? Our reservoirs supply the needs of our island, but with the effect of climate change, that's becoming more challenging every year. Manx water is the only water we have, so we need to make every drop count by using it wisely, at home, in the garden, and in general. Visit manxutilities.im to find out how you can begin smarter living, to lower energy bills and reduce your impact on our island environment.
Summer's here at B&B Furniture, and in our new garden furniture department, you'll find everything you need to relax and enjoy it, with great deals and interest-free credit available. B&B's new garden furniture department in the garden basement.
This TT, Villa Gaiety are here to entertain you with some of the best names in music and American comedy, Milton Jones, ELO Experience, Craig David presents TS5, DCAC, Pigs on the Wing, and the Steve Gibbons Band. Plus, the Bushies TT Village is back with live music, food, drink, and a great atmosphere. Visit villagaiety.com/TT or call 600 555 for details. Villa Gaiety, the island's premier entertainment venue.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
And Adrian Cowin is here from the Met Office. You were saying that you'd go out and give talks. Where do you give the talks? Where do you go?
Well, basically, if people contact me, I go out to the schools, secondary schools. I talk to geography lessons. I also give talks to other groups of people. For instance, the WI quite often invite me, which is very nice because I always get a nice cup of tea and a cake as well. But I will talk to general groups. I've given talks to the yacht clubs, and over the years, even sometimes to down at the flying club.
Another one in. This is Ollie, who just said, when was the worst weather on the Isle of Man in your umpteen years? When was the worst spell? Any protracted period of really, really bad weather?
Well, there's no such thing as bad weather. It's just the wrong coat, isn't there? But anyway, in the mid-1980s, not long after I'd started work, there was a protracted spell of sea fog in the Irish Sea, and that was a really, really nuisance. It was weeks upon weeks of low cloud and hill fog. So that was one type of bad weather. In terms of others, I would say the December 2010, we had across the British Isles 2 weeks of cold air from the north, including a lot of snow and ice, and that gave us some problems on the Isle of Man and elsewhere, so that was a bad spell. There was a period back in about the year 1999-2000 where we had a great number of severe gales. I think in December we had something like 8 days of severe gales. So yeah, it comes in some bad spells.
Okay, Julian's with us now. Hi Julian, you're live with Adrian Cowin.
Hi Andy, hi Adrian.
Hi.
Hi, just wondering Adrian, are you familiar with a story that was called The Glacier Girl?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so 15th July 1942, there was a squadron of P-38 fighters that were coming from the US to UK, and they got into bad weather over Iceland. So they had to turn back, and they had to land on a glacier in Greenland because they got lost in the snow and stuff. Now, 50 years later, in 1992, they went down and recovered one of them. But they had to dig 268 feet of snow down to get it because it had accumulated over that 50 years. And it had moved over a mile towards the sea as the glacier grew and extended out. So I'm just wondering, how do you explain that they had to dig 268 feet of snow down to get to a plane that had been buried in 1942 if we're talking about warming?
Yes, well, vague recollections of hearing a story like this and others, but in terms of how much snow and ice builds up in those regions, such as Greenland, you're remembering that at this period there wasn't that much. That wasn't even the period of general climate change that we know as we know it now. Most of the climate change period in modern times has really started to be globally measured from about the 1960s. And why the 1960s? It was during that time where there was rapid expansion of industry and power stations, mostly coal-fired power stations in places like India and China. And that still goes on today, by the way, which is, of course, part of the controversy of climate change agreements. So most of the climate change started in the 1960s, but the rate of change that I've talked about previously accelerated from about the mid-1990s. And again, that was as many other parts of the world became more industrial. So that's where there may not have been all this snow and ice deposited in the usual regions. But in that period, from the crash up until the discovery, there would have been tons upon tons and metres of depth of snow building up in the usual areas.
Right, yeah. As far as the timescales you're talking about, 40, 60, 70 years, that's a very, very zoomed in look at that graph. Because if you go back, say, 100 million years, it was 3 times the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. If you go back 150 million years, it was 5 times as much CO2. So it was actually on a downward trajectory anyway.
Well, there's that natural variation of CO2 in the atmosphere, and of course records for measuring it accurately in the atmosphere are relatively modern methods, and prior to that the methods used are ice core samples and estimating from the content of the ice core samples as to what it was historically, as you say, going back millions of years, and in periods when sometimes the planet was affected more by volcanic activity. Hence, there are CO2 records in the ice cores, but also records of volcanic ash in the ice core samples, and that's all part of natural variability. But it's the modern decades, the 2 or 3 decades, where monitoring's more useful and more detailed, and of course the atmospheric monitoring of the greenhouse gases.
What's your opinion, Julian?
Well, I mean, as you were saying, the paleoclimatologists who look at the trapped ice, say at Vostok Glacier, what point they made was, and they don't seem to be able to get a word in these days, is that the CO2 levels go up about 800 years after the warm trend starts. If you look at the temperature record in the ice, it gets warmer, but then the CO2 follows. So it's kind of cart before the horse trying to stop the CO2, isn't it? Plus the fact, of course, if you drop CO2 level lower, I mean, I think before the Industrial Revolution, the trapped ice is showing something around about 280 parts per million of CO2 in the air. Well, at 150, plant life dies. So you could argue that putting CO2 in the atmosphere might actually be helping the plant life, because if it continued on its downward trend, what happens when you go below 150?
Yeah, we do need.
You don't have plants. You don't have a world.
Yeah, we do need CO2. The level that's agreed that is dangerous was, I think, 410 parts per million. But also, may I point out, the other man-made greenhouse gases that are having the impact. So we need to be talking about nitrous oxides, and also it's a natural gas, but it's being released by climate change, is methane.
Okay, all right, Julian, we appreciate that.
Thanks very much.
Got to move
all right,
now. Thanks for calling today. And I think that point needs to be made about CO2, is that it's often vilified, but CO2 is vital. Without CO2, there's no photosynthesis. Nothing green grows.
Exactly, yes. It's an important natural gas, but where we've got it and how many parts per million, and that balance, the natural balance of the atmosphere, is all critical, and the natural world can adapt, but it needs many, many years to adapt.
And obviously you have, temperature statistics are now more, we have a lot more than ever we used to have, increasingly more and more and more. There's an impact on flora and fauna. I want to talk about sea levels, Adi. Are sea levels going up around the Isle of Man?
Yes, they are, and around the British Isles, and much of the North Atlantic as well. Rising steadily. The average rate of sea rise is from measurements is just, it doesn't sound like a lot, it's 3 millimetres per year. So there you go, you end up with 30 millimetres per decade, that's 3 centimetres. You start dialing that into 100 years, you're talking about 30 centimetres, so at least. So you're starting to get concerned, and it looks like the rate of change of sea level rise is actually on the increase as well.
So, as far as you're concerned, there is a risk, a long-term risk, but a risk to the Isle of Man from rising sea levels.
Oh, yes, indeed.
We can often sometimes seem very distant from extreme climate events.
Yeah, we do, and we feel like we're buffered, but and to some extent we are. But we are part of that sea level rise. It's global, essentially, and there's some places that are very near to sea level that will have an impact, for instance, in the Indian Ocean. Is one area of concern. But even around the British Isles, there's concern about the coastal impacts of an increasing sea level and a storminess around the British Isles as well. And we're looking at things like increasing coastal erosion as well, which is another headache for coastal communities.
The government, this is a note in from John, who just said the government recently delayed the interim target to the year 2035 despite going out to public consultation for a 2030 interim date. Can you advise what might be the climate impact for a 5-year delay based on the accelerating rate of climate change, Adi?
I personally believe that a 5-year delay is probably just about okay. I'd be concerned if it was a decade or more. So, on current trends, a 5-year delay would not be of great concern, perhaps at a local level, even for the British Isles. But every year that goes by is a missed opportunity if you haven't started to take mitigating actions.
Okay, the theoretical models for climate change are evolving all the time. Where does the public, where would you advise members of the public to get information from? Because there's so much out on the internet. Most of it is complete poppycock. But I mean, where does someone like yourself? Where do you get information from?
Well, there are some very credible sites to look at for information. First of all, there's the World Met Organization and the Americans, NOAA, the National Oceanographic Administration, who are not only monitoring the planet, but they also model the climate change and issue regular reports. There's also the IPCC, which is part of a United Nations Special Working Group. But maybe the most accessible to get to all of those is the UK Met Office website, and just look under the tab there about climate and climate change.
Okay, here's a message in. This is Fred, who just said, can you ask AD, would he recommend a career as a meteorologist?
Yes, I'd recommend it. I actually say to the school children when I'm visiting the schools that I envy them, because they're living in challenging but exciting times as scientists and engineers. And one of those career paths is as a meteorologist. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done. Exciting times ahead.
Okay, and AD, did you ever want to go on television as a TV weatherman?
No, thank you.
That was Brenda who just said that. So I'm just trying to think, have we got the Met Office now? Stuart's still there, obviously.
Yes.
There is
Kirsty.
Colin Gartshaw as well.
Neil Young.
So I'm taking it, Neil, you and Neil have been there about the same time, or were you there longer than Neil?
I've been there a fair bit longer than Neil, so yes, Neil's now 5-6 years younger than me.
We've been with AD Cowin today on Mannin Line. Thanks for being with us, AD, appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Good to talk to you. Talking about the climate, talking about the weather, and where we move to the future. Always nice to get the scientists, the professionals' view on all this. Thanks for calling in today. Thanks for all the messages about your favourite weather person. I'm not going to embarrass everybody, apart from Kirsty. Now, this coming Wednesday, the chair of the Housing Committee, Chris Thomas, MHK, is going to be on Mannin Line. If you want to get a question in, email manninline@manxradio.com, or you can call 682-631. Thanks to producer Barry Redfern. Mannin Line is back with an open line tomorrow at 12 midday.
WINT